Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project. I'm just doing a quick video on personalities versus principles and policies. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what the Nations of Sanity Project is about, the Nations of Sanity Project is based on the assertion that crime, and therefore also law, can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video, talking about focusing on personalities versus focusing on principles and policies, is because obviously through the Nations of Sanity Project and this assertion and the idea that we should establish this concept and principle as the law through a peace agreement, this is an idea. This is about a policy based on a principle. I'm not expecting people to feel any which way about me personally. And this is a problem I think we have in general in society, but also in particular in the libertarian movement, is there's a little bit too much focus on personalities and not enough focus on the principles and policies that we're supposed to be striving for. Now, there's lots of reasons why this is an issue. Obviously, the more obvious issue is, libertarianism is defined by the principles and the policies, not by the personalities or the individuals who might be championing this ideology. But also from a kind of practical point of view, from a point of view of, actually doing good and making success, we're never going to find a person to lead our movement who everyone's going to like, who's going to do everything right, who's even going to get everything right. But if we work together to focus on our principles and focus on the policies that those principles would drive, then we can build a consensus on what our North Star is, like where we want to go. What's the actual policy that we're trying to drive towards? What's the ideal scenario? What's the perhaps achievable goals, and what's perhaps the more ambitious goals that's nonetheless consistent with what we want to do? Those are the kind of arguments and debates that are worth having. But too much amongst the discourse is kind of personal insults and attacks, and people have a kind of loyalty towards personalities rather than a focus on the actual principle that we're supposedly representing, and the policy that that principle, should logically drive. As I say, with the Nations of Sanity Project, it's all about the principle, it's all about the policy. The principle is, of course, the non-aggression principle, which is the principle based on the concept of individual self-ownership. And the logical journey that I've done with the Nations of Sanity Project is to identify the non-aggression principle as the only principle that we could justifiably enforce with force as the law. It's the only law that would be justifiably enforceable. And once you realise that, the next logical step is that, well, then we should establish it as the law. But because obviously the non-aggression principle would prohibit any kind of ruling authority that might otherwise establish laws, the only way we can logically establish the non-aggression principle as the law is as the terms of a peace agreement, which would still have the same end effect of, or if you say that the non-aggression principle is the terms of peace between all people, or whether you just say it's the universal law, you're essentially saying the same thing. You're saying that these are the things that people are not allowed to do, and when force may or can and may be used against you to stop you from doing those things, or in response to you doing those things. Otherwise, individual self-ownership is about people having ownership over themselves and being able to do what they want. So if we, accept that concept, then that defines freedom for us, that defines rights for us, and that can and should objectively define crime and law. So yes, that's the policy I want to drive forward. That's the principle that it's based on. And I could be the biggest twat in the world, and it wouldn't change the validity of this idea. It wouldn't change the validity of the logic that got me to this idea. And it wouldn't serve as an argument against the idea itself. So that's what I want people to do. Obviously, with the Nations of Sanity projects, I want people to focus on that. But in general, I just think as a general message to people in general, but also to libertarians more specifically, is we need to try and do that a bit more. We need to try and really focus on the ideas and not worry about elevating or dragging down people based on our likes or dislikes as them as a person, because you know, you find the most likable person in the world and not everyone's going to like them. You know, there are libertarian commentators. Dave Smith's a good example. I think he's a very likable person and does a lot of things right within the libertarian movement, but then he gets things wrong. He's wrong on immigration, for example. Now, I'd really like to debate him on that, but not for the sake of any kind of thing against him, but just a simple fact of, I think he's wrong on this. And I think one of the things that libertarians need to do is to come together, not just on the areas where we agree, but on the area, in fact, it's even probably more important, potentially, or as important, to come together on the agreements, on the areas where we disagree, because if we explore and scrutinize those, we may be able to discover a consensus that we can kind of unite on and work towards. Because I think the biggest problem with the libertarian movement and why we haven't gotten anywhere is our failure to do that, is our failure to build a consensus of what we're trying to achieve, what the freedom we're fighting for truly looks like. And I think that's very achievable for us to achieve that consensus. I think the Nations of Sanity project represents the idea that should be our North Star, that should be our common ground. But obviously, like everything else, that is open to scrutiny. But that's what I want people to focus on. So I don't want to make this a long video, just wanted to kind of get that basic message across to people in general. You know, focus a little less on personality contests and you know, on what individual we need. You know, people say, oh, we need a Ron Paul, or we need a Murray Rothbard alive again, or we need a, you know, it doesn't matter. It's not about that. It's we all need to come together and actually build a consensus, because a lot of these people might be wrong on one particular issue. And if we work together and put our egos aside, I think we can kind of sort the truth from the untruths and the misunderstandings of the principles. I think most things have a pretty objective answer when it comes to exploring what is and isn't a violation of the non-aggression principle, which is why it's such an ideal standard of law, because it doesn't require or allow any kind of ruling authority to define what crime and law is, or where our rights and freedom end and begin. That is already objectively identifiable by the concept of individual self-ownership. Once we've got that consensus that everyone has right over themselves, everything else can and should fall into place. And where there are disagreements, or where it doesn't seem to be falling into place, that's where we need to put our focus and attention on, to kind of understand why there's disagreement on there and who is right and wrong on that area. Not for the sake of denigrating any people or elevating any people, but for the sake of getting to truth together as a united movement. So yeah, so that's my message to people in general, and that's my message to libertarians in particular. Please just focus on the ideas, focus on the arguments, focus on the principle and the policy, and while you're doing it, please consider the principle and policy as it's represented by the Nations of Sanity project, because I think that is the winner.